Twin Ports Climate Conversation. The title of today's talk is called Giving Nature a Nudge, an Assisted Migration Plan for the Superior National Forest. And I'm really excited to introduce our two speakers for today, which I will do in just a moment. First, I just want to orient everyone who may not be as familiar with Twin Ports Climate Conversations. This is a partnership of several organizations who put on these monthly conversations with the goal of aiding and improving, I'll advance my slide here for a moment. Aiding and improving climate communication skills for everyone, improving climate change related data collection and sharing, to motivate and support community-based adaptation efforts, to increase climate change conversations in more sectors to broaden the impact and inclusion of and consideration of climate justice in each of these conversations. So I'd like to thank the partner organizations who help put these on every month. That's the Minnesota Sea Grant Program, the Wisconsin Sea Grant Program, the 1854 Treaty Authority, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and the Minnesota's Lake Superior Coastal Program at the DNR. And I should introduce myself quickly. My name is Hillary Sorensen. I'm the climate specialist with the 1854 Treaty Authority. We are an intertribal natural resource management agency tasked with preserving and protecting treaty rights in the 1854 ceded territory. And we are governed by the Bois Forte Band of Chippewa and Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. So as Madison mentioned, we're gonna have two presenters today. We'll have everyone on mute during that time, but please feel free to type any questions that you might have in the chat box. And then once the presentation is done, we will open things up for questions. So at that time, you'll be able to either continue to just type your questions into the box or unmute yourself to ask your question out loud. And then finally, we did email out a survey recently to this mailing list, and we're going to put a link to that survey in the chat box. So if you have not had a chance to fill that out, please do consider filling out that survey. That's reflecting on the past several years of Twin Ports Climate Conversations, and we are always looking for ways to improve these. So if you have any ideas or if you'd like to become involved in the planning of these monthly conversations, please contact one of us and let us know your thoughts. Okay, so with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers today. I'm really pleased to be joined by Stephen Handler and James McFarland today. Stephen is a climate change specialist with the Forest Service's Northern Research Station and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. He's located in Houghton, Michigan. His main role with NIAX is to coordinate the Northwoods Climate Change Response Framework, which involves building partnerships, assessing climate change risk, and working with forest managers and landowners to develop real-world projects to adapt and prepare for change. And James McFarland is also joining us today. He's a natural resources staff officer with the Superior National Forest located here in Duluth. And James is going to help provide some background and context for how the Superior National Forest is starting to look at assisted migration as a climate adaptation tool. Okay, so I'll stop sharing my screen and hand things over to you, Stephen. Thanks for being with us today.
Great. Okay, just to make sure, can you still hear me okay? Perfect. Well, I was going to try to send a couple side chats to folks who I recognized on the participant list because I got really excited seeing some familiar names, but now that I'm already on the spot, I guess I'll just say out loud because I can't constrain my enthusiasm. It's great to see Clarence Turner on this webinar. I hope you're doing well, Clarence. So thanks everyone. In addition to Clarence, I'm glad to see a long participant list on here and glad to see that there's interest in this topic. James and I will be going back and forth throughout this presentation, so please don't hesitate to direct questions to either or both of us. It's nice that we can kind of ride shotgun during this hour. So we're here to talk about a project that's underway on the Superior National Forest. We'll get into the details here, and something that we will make clear is that this is a broad partnership effort. And so many of you on the webinar that I'm seeing today have already been involved in some respect. Those of you who have not yet been involved and might like to, don't consider this train having already left the station. There's still probably an opportunity for you to get involved in this work if it's something that excites you and that you feel you might be able to contribute to. So just in case you're not familiar with the group that I work for, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, I just wanted to introduce us briefly. Maybe Kristen has already talked about NIAX on one of these past meetings, but in case you're new to NIAX, I should mention that we're kind of an interesting hybrid between federal and non-federal partners. So you see the logos on the screen here. NIAX has a steering group, or basically a board of directors, that decides what we are and how we can be most useful to the land management community. That includes all three branches of the Forest Service, National Forest System, state and private forestry, and the research side of the Forest Service, as well as three universities, including University of Minnesota, a national conservation organization, a forest industry science group, that's the National Council for Air and Stream Improvement, and most recently, GLFWC, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. It's the newest organization to join our steering group. And so all of these organizations have different perspectives and backgrounds, and that creates, some really complex DNA within NIAX, but it also gives us a lot of flexibility. And so our mandate is basically to provide technical assistance, practical guidance, and just kind of coaching and consultation around climate and carbon issues. So for anyone and everyone in the land management community who's interested to have a discussion about climate change risk, or how might I adapt, or what does my management mean for carbon across the landscape, we are created to be kind of like a help desk or a phone a friend service. So that's what NIAX is. You can learn more about us at niax.org, the website you see on the screen there. So usually when I start presentations, I have to give a pretty big wind-up about what do we mean when we talk about climate change? What are some of the evidence of climate change? What have we already observed in Minnesota and throughout the region? Unfortunately, I don't think I have to do that with this audience, seeing that you already have a long track record of talking about climate change issues in this region, in the Lake States and probably northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin in particular. And so that's kind of a relief. We'll get into more of the nuts and bolts that we need to cover. The only thing I'll say is that it's clear that climate change is pulling and pushing the levers that might govern the health and sustainability of our forests. And that is pervasive really throughout forest ecosystems. When you think about the factors that govern which forest types and which species can thrive and survive in an area, when you think about conditions that make it suitable or not suitable for us to work in these systems and manage them. When you think about the stressors that might affect the health of forests across the Lake States region, whether it's deer, insect pests, pathogens, stresses like drought. Climate change has the ability to affect all of these different forcings. And that in turn affects the ability of forests to continue providing valuable services to us, whether it's an economic resource for the forest products industry in our state, whether it's cultural values, say that being able to go out and practice birch bark harvesting across the landscape, whether it's ecological services like forests providing clean drinking water. The fact is that climate change is affecting the prospect that our forests will be able to continue providing these values. And so it's worth taking a hard look at what it means for our landscape. And I'm sure you all are already doing that. Some of you have made a career out of this already. And just to introduce another term that I'm sure most of us are familiar with, but James and I will be talking a lot about climate adaptation today. And just to use a very broad and kind of all-encompassing definition of climate adaptation, basically we say that anything you can do to adjust systems in preparation or in response to climate change counts as adaptation. But importantly, adaptation depends on intentionally addressing climate change impacts and vulnerabilities. And so adaptation is not just assuming that business as usual is going to hold up and that you can skate by doing what you've always done. Adaptation demands kind of an eyes-up assessment of risks and opportunities, and thinking critically about how you're going to continue to meet your goals and satisfy your values across the landscape. So adaptation demands some critical thinking and attention. So under that general rubric of climate adaptation, James and I are going to be talking about an assisted migration plan that the Superior National Forest is pursuing. And before we really launch into it, I'm going to spend a few minutes defining assisted migration, because it's one of those ideas that can kind of be a lightning rod, but it's also a little more complex and a little more nuanced than sometimes we might give it credit for. So just a few minutes here on assisted migration. And so generally, assisted migration means intentionally moving species or individuals to help adapt to climate change. So assisted migration in this context is one of those climate adaptation practices that you can do. But there are a couple different flavors or a couple different varieties of assisted migration, and I want to be sure we're all clear with what those varieties are. So I'm going to walk through them. So the first type of assisted migration, kind of the lowest risk type of assisted migration, probably the least challenging type of assisted migration, is what we call assisted population migration. And so in the context of forests and tree species, this is the idea that if you have a widely distributed tree species, like say white pine, where its range extends, quite a large span north and south, then you might grab some seeds from further south in that species range and plant them further north, or move west to east to track precipitation gradients. Whatever it is, you're trying to grab seeds from one part of a species range in order to try to intentionally move genetic material and heritable traits that might help you adapt to change. So assisted population migration. And this has come to the foreground recently within the National Forest because for many, many years, since the 70s, national forests in the US have been asked to abide by this common notion that local is best when it comes to tree planting. And so I'm showing you a map of all the national forests in the eastern region of the Forest Service. That's all of the Midwest up to New England. And what you're seeing here, the green is all of the national forest land. And those black outlines around the national forests are approved seed collection zones that the Forest Service has instituted as policy. So if the Superior National Forest wants to plant seed on national forest land, they have to gather seed from within that polygon in order to plant it. So we're kind of institutionalizing this idea that local is best. And this has been policy from the Forest Service since the 1970s. But now we know, climate change has already been proceeding since the 70s and is expected to continue. And so, you see how these polygons, they kind of seem like drawn pen on a map. And so this is kind of artificially constraining what national forests can do, and it's limiting that idea of grabbing seed from elsewhere within a species range. Well, just recently, the Forest Service released new guidance for every national forest in the eastern region. I said, okay, now you can crack open that local is best concept. And if you want to gather seed, you can start to look elsewhere, because we recognize that the climate has already changed and is likely to continue changing. And so every national forest now has maps like this. I'm showing you the maps for the Superior National Forest. You see that they're different based on whether it's an inland planting site on the left or a planting site along the North Shore. That's because of local climatic differences, as well as differences that are expected to continue in the coming decades with climate change. So now this is an open opportunity for every national forest in the eastern US to consider this assisted population migration opportunity, because we have this new guidance. Okay, that's kind of a quick segment on assisted population migration. The next level of assisted migration is this idea of assisted range expansion. And this gets to the idea that, well, you might anticipate that a species will naturally be able to migrate to new suitable habitat in order to keep pace with climate change. But you might want to step on the gas a little, and you might want to give it a boost to help it migrate a little faster, because maybe you have pressing needs, or maybe you think climate change will proceed faster and that species might be able to naturally migrate. So for example, take a species like silver maple. I'm showing you the native range of silver maple here in the gray shaded area. And you see it kind of proceeds fairly far north in Minnesota, but it stops south of the Superior National Forest. Well, let's say we have an instance like emerald ash borer sweeping through the state, and killing ash trees in wetland forests, wetland hardwoods in particular. So now many managers are looking for supplemental or potential replacement species for ash in order to maintain the hydrologic function of these wetland forests. So you could imagine a lowland hardwood like silver maple being planted just a bit further north of its native range in order to help meet some ecological objective, like sustaining wetland forests further north in Minnesota. That's an example of assisted range expansion. Okay, and the third and probably most controversial, most difficult flavor of assisted migration is this idea that often gets the most attention and is what people automatically assume we're talking about when we talk about assisted migration. And that's this idea of assisted species migration, which is taking an individual and moving it beyond some natural migration boundary in order to find some suitable habitat in the future that might be sustainable with climate change. And so maybe a local example could be a species like black walnut, which currently has a native range that creeps into Minnesota, into the driftless area. You'll find it, southeastern Minnesota. And so we have model results and projections that show, yeah, black walnut might have suitable habitat far north into Minnesota by the end of the century. It's a very heavy seed. It's not going to migrate there on its own without human assistance. And so if we were to plant it today in northern Minnesota, that would be a case of this long distance migration, because you would be artificially crossing some natural migration boundaries, like a whole bunch of grassland and urban area beyond the natural dispersal ability of this tree. So those are the three flavors of assisted migration. If you want to learn more about assisted migration in general, I would definitely recommend going to this webpage called the Climate Change Resource Center, CCRC. And if you go there and search for assisted migration, they have a nice summary page that shows more information about this topic and how it's been employed elsewhere in the US. So that's a little background. Now I want to turn it over to James so he can set the stage on why did this come up for the Superior. James?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen, and greatly appreciate everybody in the invite today to talk about this great project that we're embarking on the Superior. This effort's been going, Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, for about 1.5 years, almost 2 years now. When I first arrived, I've been on the forest for about a little over 3 years now, a forester by training and a silviculturist looking at, forestry in the lake states for almost a decade now. And when I arrived at the forest, there was some discussion, how are we going to start to address climate change, or how do we continue to integrate climate adaptation into our planning efforts as we manage the national forest. We had some very small instances where we've been starting to dabble in looking at various kind of the first two types of assisted migration that Stephen talked about, with population migration and range expansion on the forest, very small 5, 10, 20 acre sites, and that we were starting to take a look at the opportunities and recognizing what may or may not work, and applying the great work that NIAX has done to help us guide that discussion of, where, when, why, how. But really, when I got here, I asked my team here to take a pause and take a step back and look more broadly at how can we develop a plan that's very intentional for the Superior to follow as we begin to apply assisted migration to be more adaptive in our management, recognizing that climate change has and is going to influence the way that we manage our national forests. It's going to influence the wildlife habitat that we manage, the forest products that we produce on the forest, all the way down to the recreational opportunities and just the general experience of the national forest. So when I was working with the team, I really asked them to take a step back and how do we take a much more broader look at the path that we should be walking forward for assisted migration, recognizing that we as an agency have agency policy to follow, but also more importantly is our forest plan that guides our management of the national forest, that identifies our objectives, are integrated across all of the resources that we manage, social and economical, and the day-to-day operations of the forest, that really helps us guide what we do here on the forest and really tie into how do we manage our national forest to meet all of those objectives. Our forest plan was last approved in 2004, was the forest plan that we were working off, was fairly silent about climate change. At that time, the agency, we knew about climate change, but it wasn't heavily integrated into our forest planning efforts. Thus, assisted migration was not even really mentioned in our plan. So the question is, how can we as a forest continue to move forward, although our forest plan was silent? Well, the forest plan also talks about using best available science. Our best available science is ever changing, and we are gaining more and more knowledge, especially as organizations like NIAX produce the products that they use or have developed for us to use and implementing on our landscape. And assisted migration is a piece of that we felt that we needed to take the next intentional step to provide or to develop a plan for the forest to be able to implement an assisted migration or any type of assisted migration on the forest. Why? The big question is why? We've had leadership on the forest that have varying ranges of experience in applying climate change adaptation, varying range of understanding of assisted migration. especially as we started this conversation, we had a full range of understanding of those three categories that Stephen talked about, and many, as Stephen mentioned, move to species migration. The thought process of bringing ponderosa pine from the Western United States and planting it on the Superior, or which is comparable to red pine, or bringing lodgepole pine to replace jack pine. And that was some of the very first things that started coming out as, well, are you doing this? Very clearly here on the forest, we are being extremely intentional that our intent is not species migration at this point. But the intent of our developing an assisted migration plan is to develop a consistent framework for our leadership team and our natural resources professionals out in the field to use as we engage in this conversation. The other big critical piece for me as well is, how do we engage our research partners at the universities, the research institutes, as well as our branch of the Forest Service, our researchers, to engage in this conversation. So when we are applying assisted migration on the landscape, we are able to watch that, monitor that, show the implications, and be able to learn from our experiences and identify opportunities as we move more broadly and farther. What I would say is the team that has come together has been a multi-stakeholder group. We have over 20 stakeholders with over 100 participants that have been working on this plan to really capture a broad range of perspectives. It is extremely important for us to do that, recognizing that this plan is a guiding document as we make future planning effort decisions and what we would call our environmental analysis decisions. This plan will inform that process. This is not a decision that the way we're going to do it on the forest, but this will inform our process. And it allows then our other stakeholders that may not be included in this conversation as we develop the plan to comment on those through what we call our National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA regulations. So there's a little distinction there. I would also like to highlight, the importance of working with all the views of our stakeholders, our tribal partners, our industry partners, our forest users, the recreationalists. There's a long list that I'm missing. A lot of those are extremely important for us to take into consideration as we look at the assisted migration plan that we're trying to develop here for the forest. So with that, I'll turn it over to Stephen to talk a little bit more of the dirty details of the whole plan, and really appreciate folks joining today and listening about this great product that we're developing.
Thanks, James. I appreciate it. So one thing that James mentioned that I want to re-emphasize is that assisted migration is not the only game in town. The Superior National Forest has already been thinking about climate change for a lot of years and has already been doing work to help prepare for climate change. Assisted migration is just one tool in the toolbox. So for example, the work that the Superior is already doing to, say, reduce existing threats from climate change, like managing hazardous fuels across the forest and reducing the potential for catastrophic wildfire in WUI corridors and other sensitive areas. That's an example of climate adaptation. Managing forests for a diversity of species and age classes and structures. That's also an example of climate change adaptation, because you can do it intentionally to spread risk and kind of hedge your bets within a forest. So assisted migration is one tool in the toolbox. It is potentially a controversial tool and a shiny tool, which is why it's worth kind of doing this extra effort to make a plan and how it might be implemented. The other thing that I will emphasize is that at NIAX, we often talk about multiple pathways of climate adaptation, from trying to play resistance, to try to manage for resilience, or to try to encourage transition. Those are 3 general options when it comes to preparing for change. And assisted migration can kind of fit into all of them, especially when you consider the multiple flavors of assisted migration. So for example, if you're most interested in pursuing resistance and keeping an ecosystem the way it is, keeping a forest type the way it is, that's kind of like, you know, hardening the coast along New York City and trying to prepare for sea level rise. It's not going to be an option in perpetuity, but it's definitely an option you want to have in your toolbox if you have an area of high cultural or economic value or ecological value. And so there may be options where assisted migration can complement this resistance mindset. For example, take a species like black spruce that is vulnerable to climate change, but exists in ecologically vulnerable or vulnerable and important systems like, you know, peat bogs. Well, assisted migration might give the Superior National Forest the option to go and collect seed from black spruce further south in its range, say dipping into northern Wisconsin or the western UP, like I showed on those maps earlier, as a potential to maybe bring in some genetic material to help, you know, introduce some more favorable traits for that species. In a resilience mindset, where you're trying to help a system cope with change by giving a lot of plasticity and flexibility, like I mentioned in that emerald ash borer context, trying to introduce some supplemental species in those wetland hardwoods, like silver maple, potentially others, red maple, hackberry. You know, those might be examples of kind of a resilience mindset for assisted migration. And then there's always going to be opportunities to look for transition opportunities, say, you know, encouraging more oak in some areas where it might be suitable on the Superior National Forest. Might be a way to do kind of a subtle transition. James mentioned the list of partners and stakeholders who have been involved. I thought I would just highlight those in case folks are interested. So we have participation from across the Superior National Forest in terms of, you know, many different resource disciplines, but also folks from the DNR, folks from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, county forest managers, universities, organizations like the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative and Forest Service Research, Minnesota Tree Improvement Co-op, the Nature Conservancy, Minnesota Forest Industries, the list goes on, and then a big list of tribal partners as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. One of the ways we're trying to proceed deliberately here is to make sure that we're exploring all of the sensitivities that are out there around assisted migration, and also to make sure that we're trying to incorporate the knowledge that already exists that could help make more informed assisted migration decisions. So in that spirit, we decided that there's more than any one group can probably contribute to this plan. So we created several different working groups following an initial stakeholder call in May of last year. And these help us consolidate some expertise around different topics and also help us identify a group of committed and interested partners who are willing to lend their expertise in kind of a, you know, a long drawn out planning process. So for example, we have a genetic considerations group that is identifying, well, what information do we have about the genetic distribution for different tree species that are of interest for assisted migration? And are there gaps in that knowledge? We have a group that is just thinking about seed sourcing logistics. So let's say you identify new areas in the state or outside of the state Or you might want to gather seed in the future. Well, that's going to require thinking about the supply chain from who's going to gather seed from forests in those areas. Will it be, seed that is able to be grown and germinated in Forest Service nurseries, or will it require other nurseries? And then what does it take to actually get those seedlings in the ground? So thinking about that supply chain is its own working group, because there are a lot of complexities involved in that process. So I'm showing you all of the working groups here now. Just in the interest of time, I wanted to just do a quick dive into 2 of these working groups so you can get a flavor of the kinds of discussions we've been having so far and how we're incorporating the perspectives and expertise of stakeholders. So the first that I'll focus on, you may have noticed that we have a cultural connections working group. And this working group is built around this notion that decisions that the Superior National Forest makes may affect tribes in particular and tribal communities in different ways than the general public. For those who aren't familiar, I'm showing a map of Native American ceded territory land in the Lake States. The green polygon there in northern Minnesota is the 1854 ceded territory, the Superior National Forest, and the 1854 ceded territory spans at least 3 tribal reservations. So Grand Portage, Fond du Lac, actually Bois Forte is just outside, but they're close enough that they have a lot of close partnership and cooperation with the Superior National Forest. And so tribal communities in this landscape obviously are concerned with what climate change means for the health and sustainability of these forests. Making decisions about assisted migration could influence some of the values that they hold on this landscape. And so this working group is supposed to help explore that and make sure that we're being intentional about those sensitivities. Because once you start making decisions about assisted migration, you very clearly start affecting lots of values across the landscape, not just with a forestry context about tipping the balance between vulnerable and non-vulnerable species, but also assisted migration decisions can influence fish and wildlife habitat, water resources, other interactions between plants and animals. And then in some cases, species that are candidates for assisted migration have deep and long-standing cultural connections. And so how might you proceed if one of the species in question is particularly valuable to tribal communities? So in this working group, we have held a series of roundtable discussions with tribal natural resources staff and community members from across the ceded territory. We've had a lot of good discussions, for example, that talk about this issue of ash forests, like I've mentioned a couple times, and what are suitable ways to approach this issue of declining ash species. We've talked about implications of moose habitat with assisted migration. For example, does introducing more oak into the landscape tip the balance against moose, because you might be creating a favorable mast source for deer? And we know that more deer on the landscape is bad for moose. So those were some surprises. And then we also, talked about, like I mentioned, some of these iconic cultural tree species like northern white cedar, and whether or not there is information known about its genetics and whether seeds might be able to be gathered from neighboring areas and in partnership with neighboring tribes to import, like I said, new genetic material into the ceded territory. These discussions have been aided by a tool that I wanted to mention briefly called the Tribal Adaptation Menu. This has been kind of a nice backstop for us as we've had these roundtable discussions. The Tribal Adaptation Menu is a tool that helps express climate adaptation concepts in and through an Indigenous lens, so that it can be a kind of a communication tool between tribal and non-tribal partners. Madison posted the link there in the chat, it looks like. But one of the things I'll mention is that this Tribal Adaptation Menu document does express some different ideas related to assisted migration, but also put kind of a new spin on them in a way that that kind of modified some of the ways that we might implement assisted migration on the Superior National Forest. For example, if there's opportunity to collect seed in northern Wisconsin for some of these vulnerable beings, maybe we can work together between the bands and the national forests to make requests of tribes in those places in northern Wisconsin, and ask if we can do that seed collection in partnership and with these practices of respect and reciprocity. So to do it in a good way. The other working group that I wanted to spotlight is one that is focused on research and monitoring. As you might imagine, there's a lot of unanswered questions when it comes to assisted migration. In terms of how can we learn from the pilot efforts that we start on the Superior, as well as what information already exists out there in the landscape that might inform our efforts. So these are some of the key questions that this working group has been considering. And just as an example, I'm showing you a graphic from a recent paper from the Nature Conservancy and other partners in Minnesota. They identified some of the barriers to scaling up our tree planting capacity across the country. And all of these places in the seed collection and planting pipeline that I mentioned, all of them demand some level of research and investigation, because a lot of them will have new practices involved with them. So testing the effectiveness of this will help us become more efficient and hopefully avoid some of the blunders that we will make initially. So that's what we had planned. Hopefully that was enough to give you a little bit of a flavor of how we're proceeding and what kinds of questions we're considering as we put together this assisted migration plan. And we're looking forward to hearing what questions you have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephen and James, for presenting that. I've heard a little bit about this project and I still feel like I learned some new things today. So much appreciated. I'm sure other people on the call feel that way too. We do have a couple questions that have come in. So maybe I'll start with some of the more specific ones that are kind of getting into some of the nuts and bolts about species here. And I know neither of you have claimed to be geneticists, so feel free to refer to other sources of information if you can't answer these. But one question that came in is the Superior National Forest considering Manchurian ash as a viable replacement for black ash?
So Manchurian ash has been tested in an experimental setting on the Chippewa National Forest as one of those suitable replacements for black ash. That was one of the species they planted in a big trial. They got special permits to do that, importing a species from outside of the continental US. I think that's way beyond something that the Superior would feel comfortable doing at scale. And I don't think anything like Manchurian ash is under consideration. James, what would you say?
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going, Stephen, as I know of the case and visited the site on the Chippewa where that is being used. But currently, because of the earliness of that research project, it's not in consideration for use on the Superior at this time. outside of any other potential research opportunities. So I think that would be a very narrow window of opportunity until there's a little bit more known and we see some outcomes from that research done on the Chippewa.
Great, thank you. So another one that's kind of species specific that came in, this one is on red pine. So someone wanted to know, is red pine suitable for population migration despite its limited genetic variability?
So I think that's kind of an open question. We have, so this is what I've heard from the geneticists who are part of our team. And this is what you hear from, Forest Service folks who were around when they established those seed collection zones. Some of our earliest indications that local is best is from red pine plantation failures, where they collected red pine in one area and tried to plant it in another area, and that plantation failed. So they started zeroing in on, oh, okay, how far can we stretch that? So that gives the indication that there is some genetic variability across the red pine, even though it occurs in kind of a limited range. So I think it's worth exploring, and I know that the genetics group is thinking harder about that.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Yeah, that was one that I thought maybe you'd have to kick to a geneticist eventually, but thanks for that that information on some of the discussion you've heard from those folks. This is kind of a two-part question, and I think also ties into probably some of those discussions that the working groups you mentioned are having at this point. So the first part of this question is, do you have any preliminary ideas on how you'll identify stands of climate-forward trees for seed collection? So maybe again, thinking about that logistics of seed collection side of things, and how that might tie in with some of the modeling results on climate adapted species is how I'm interpreting that. And Joel, if you want to clarify, I think at this point you can come off of mute and clarify your question if you want to.
I think that's basically what I was asking. Yeah, I think I'm interested in the logistics of how you go about it.
James, have you sat in on any of the seed collection discussions?
I haven't, Stephen, but kind of putting in on my other hat, just thinking of the way, historically, even those 1970s seed zones were established, really looking for native stands that have some genetic variabilities, building some, not only collecting from one stand, but also getting multiple stands in there to have some variability in that. So I think there's going to be more of a filter process and looking at those other species and stands. But I don't know the exact specifics that we'll be applying as we look at that.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about, so for example, we have forest silviculturists from the Ottawa National Forest in the Western UP and the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest in Northern Wisconsin. They're part of the seed collection group. And so one of the possibilities is identifying those seed collection opportunities on other national forest land, since that would be, a little easier to manage the federal to federal pipeline. But like I mentioned, we're also thinking about working with tribal partners in those seed collection zones. So perhaps, say, just for an example, the Bad River Reservation in northern Wisconsin, maybe working in partnership with them, they could help identify some suitable seed collection areas for a species like paper birch to move up to northern Minnesota. We haven't, I guess you can probably tell, we haven't ironed it out yet.
Well, Steve, if I can maybe add to that a little bit too, is truly it is going to be reliant on our partners, especially, with where the Superior and the Chippewa National Forest lie. most of those seed zones are south, as Stephen mentioned. There's other national forests that may capture some of those seed zones, but we'll be also looking to our partners in the tribes, but also we're remiss if I didn't mention our county and state partners and opportunities that we have to develop for even further on the development of or collection of seed.
Great, thank you. And I'm sort of interpreting the second part of Joel's question is also, that probably more detail than you have at this point, something that the working group is working through. But the second part of that question is, do you have any ideas on how to track seed from collection through processing and nursery growth to planting?
So I can jump on that one, Stephen. I think as an agency as a whole, we already have, or even our nurseries that service not only the Forest Service, but all the other agencies and even the private nurseries already have a pretty well established process of tracking collection of seed, the processing of that seed, all the way through the nursery process. And then for us, even out into the field of where those trees are planted, we have pretty good records. What I would say is with diving into assisted migration, we will probably increase a lot more of that documentation, and really that's that part of that connection with our research, so that we can be in the long term monitoring either the success or the failure of that species as we've moved, and also really capturing what may be influencing the success of or failure. Someone mentioned the question on red pine. I've got some experience over in Michigan where we brought up jack pine from the lower part of Michigan up into the UP. We isolated where we planted that specific stock, and what we found is it did not perform as we thought it would. We actually had a more of a failure than a success as we used that stock from the Huron-Manistee up north on the Hiawatha. That was a learning experience, and that's why we have been tracking from collection all the way to implementation very closely.
Great, thank you. These are awesome questions and great further discussion here. I've got a couple more that I'll try to get through from folks in the chat. So this next one, I'm sure, is on a lot of people's minds, but how can private citizens help with assisted migration? And then the second part of that question is, can we collect seeds and plant them on national forest land? So again, kind of a two-parter there.
I'll take the first part. James, you maybe want to take the second part right away.
Okay, go for it.
How can private citizens get involved? There are a couple different efforts underway where private landowners can start to get involved with assisted migration. Don't go out and plant seed on private national forest land just yet. But if you've got your own property, well, I'll say two things. Number one, there's opportunity through conservation districts, for example. Many in Michigan and northern Wisconsin, say at annual tree sales, they're starting to offer a broader mix of tree species than historically they might have. And they might even be able to work with you to identify some kind of climate-informed tree species planting for your own property. So if you have a consulting forester, a conservation district forester, other service forester, you might be able to talk with them about trying a few new individuals on your own property. I know I have done that on my own property. And it's fun to see how those things tolerate our winters, and some of them thrive, some of them fail. The other thing I'll say is that there's an effort underway, trying to draw the name right now, but there's a new cooperative that's being started in northeastern Minnesota to help that seed collection bottleneck that folks anticipate. And so there's a group that's actually working with farmers in that area to help collect seed in southern and central Minnesota and plant it on their farms and create seed orchards on farmland in northern Minnesota to start expanding that amount of stock that's available for these climate adapted species. I'll do a little Googling on the side here and try to get that URL to put in the chat.
Yeah, Stephen, great, great perspective on that. And what I would say is like Stephen mentioned, is and a plea for me is, please don't go collect species and outplant them on the forest. Really, the intent of this plan is so we can track those, track the successes and failures. Also is what we're, in this day and age, really being aware of invasive species, because we also want to track, are we bringing something that is going to be more prolific than we originally anticipated? As somebody mentioned about Manchurian ash, that's part of the concern there. We want to test its ability to perform, but we also want to ensure that it does not get into a place that it starts displacing our native species. As far as seed collection, I would ask that not even for just the conversation related to assisted migration, but if folks are interested in cone collection, even of our existing species, it is one thing that we struggle on a year-to-year basis, us, the DNR, and even our counties, is to get individuals that are interested in picking cones and bringing them in to the various offices for us to use in our operations. That being said, if you are interested in that, please reach out to whether it's your local Forest Service, your local DNR, or county offices to find out the procedure and protocols that we ask folks to follow. Because we do, as I mentioned earlier, we do track that seed from the site that it's collected all the way through the site it's planted. Other agencies also have a little more flexibility. The Forest Service is limited on who we can buy from because we can only have a certain way that we can pay. But our DNR partners are being able to pay with a check over the counter. So those types of things are consideration. So if you're interested in that, not only as part of the assisted migration, but even just on the national forest as it is, please reach out and we can help you get set up to help us manage your national forest lands.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So hopefully a lot of folks found that useful, a lot of great ways to get involved with these efforts. We do have a couple other questions, and maybe our speakers will hang out for another minute or two if folks have other things to ask. But I do want to give everyone a few important links and information about our next Twin Ports Climate Conversation meeting. So the next meeting is going to be held on May 18th. And we're going to be having Dr. Heidi Roop join us. She is with the University of Minnesota, and she's going to be leading an interactive session thinking about strategies and opportunities to accelerate climate adaptation in the Western Lake Superior area. So that should be really exciting. And I just want to really thank Stephen and James for joining us today and kicking off such a great discussion and questions on assisted migration, letting us know about some of the important efforts right here that are going on in front of us. So thank you so much. And maybe I'll ask Madison to pop the link to where this recording will be housed into the chat one more time if people want to grab that before they sign off. And just a quick reminder that there is a survey requesting your feedback on this series. And so if you have thoughts on that or how to improve this series for us, please go ahead and fill out that feedback survey. We'd love to hear your thoughts. So anyone who has to go, feel free to sign off. Otherwise, we'll stick around for a few other questions. And John, maybe we'll be able to get to yours that you put in the chat if you are still here. Okay, I still see John's name on here, so let's get to that one. And I, I think it's a really good question. I might broaden it a little bit even. So John was asking, are Arctic alpine disjunct species and habitats within the Superior National Forest being monitored for decline or changes in viability? And, maybe that opens it up just to talk a little bit more about monitoring efforts in general on the Superior and how you're kind of, tracking species successes under future climates. I don't know if there's anything at this point you can comment on related to that.
So one thing I'll say is that this plan right now, we're just kind of limiting ourselves to tree species. And so we're not, just in case this is something you're thinking, we're not currently thinking about assisted migration for, understory species, plants and forbs, grasses and forbs, and anything like that. James, maybe you can talk about monitoring of those Arctic disjunct populations.
Yeah, just in general, we are monitoring some of those, and I would say not all of those, and more specifically where we have a species of concern. We call them regional forester sensitive species. In some cases fall into those disjunct categories, and we are trying to monitor those, but it is, one of those limiting factors of personnel and time to monitor each of those. What I would say is, though, is we do have some partners that are doing some monitoring for us on the forest. We also have a number of researchers with the universities and other research organizations that are looking heavily at some of those disjunct populations and trying to learn more about those and better understand their distribution and their resiliency to climate change.
Awesome, thank you. I want to make sure we got through all the questions in the chat, but I think our Sea Grant hosts actually have to hop off to another meeting as well. So we should probably round this off. But again, Stephen and James both had their emails up in that final slide if folks want to contact them with any other specific questions. And thank you all so much for joining us to talk about this today, and especially to our speakers. Much appreciated.